Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I am Jim White, Craver Family Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It is my great honor to welcome you to this Abbey Speaker Series event, a conversation with Irshad Manji. The Abbey Speaker Series is hosted by UNC's Program for Public Discourse, which is in the College of Arts and Sciences. The Program for Public Discourse seeks to build our students' capacities for debate and deliberation, and to foster a culture of constructive dialogue about issues of national importance at UNC and beyond. 4 times each year, the Abbey Speaker Series brings together experts from different fields and disciplines to showcase productive dialogue on timely issues across a range of perspectives. Previous topics have included faith and abortion, the future of affirmative action, and journalism and democracy, to name just a few. The titles alone give you an idea of the breadth, the ambition, and the scope of this important speaker series. On behalf of the university, I would like to thank the Abbey family for helping us bring such timely and relevant programming to campus. It is critical that our students learn how to discuss and debate difficult topics. Here, they can see a respectful exchange of ideas and opinions in action and see how it is done. That's your charge. I would also like to thank Carolina alumni for sponsoring this evening's event. In keeping with the Program for Public Discourse's emphasis on fostering constructive dialogue, Dr. Leah Cox will be interviewing Irshad Manji during tonight's program. Irshad is the founder of Moral Courage College, which teaches people to turn contentious issues into constructive conversations and healthy teamwork. A prize-winning leadership professor at New York University for many years, she now teaches at Oxford University's Initiative for Global Ethics and Human Rights. Her latest book is called Don't Label Me: How to Do Diversity Without Inflaming the Culture Wars. Our interviewer, Leah Cox, currently serves as the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and the Chief Diversity Officer here at Carolina. Before joining Carolina in 2021, she served as the inaugural Vice President for Inclusion and Institutional Equity at Towson University. It has been my great pleasure to work with Leah, as both of us serve on the Chancellor's and Provost's leadership cabinets. She works especially closely with Carla Slocum, my Senior Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and we work to ensure an environment of community and belonging for all in the college. We greatly value Leah's advice and counsel amid a changing legal landscape, which I'm sure we'll hear about more today in the discussion that is about to start. Irshad has written about a range of issues over the course of her career, including pluralism, Islam, and diversity training, and tonight's interview will likely cover those and multiple other topics. Leah and Irshad are planning to discuss their different approaches to diversity, equity, and inclusion training, a topic that has recently been a source of controversy in many parts of the country, including right here in our own state. I welcome the opportunity for us to explore these topics from differing aspects, and I'm honored to be introducing 2 such accomplished and thoughtful participants. Let us warmly welcome Irshad Manji and Leah Cox.
Thank you, Dean White. All right, we're ready to get this evening started. Is everybody ready? Oh, that was really lackluster.
You're not going to get away with that when Leah's up on stage. Okay.
Okay, so we want to talk about a book, and if you haven't bought the book, this is the book. That is definitely worth a read, whether you agree or disagree, right? It's going to bring up ideas and thoughts and feelings that you may or may not have thought about regarding diversity, equity, inclusion, culture, labels, identities, all of those things. And so we're going to talk about some of those things tonight, and hopefully we will have a rousing discussion, which I think we will. And then we will save 30 minutes at the end for you to come up, and you'll see the signs on either side, and you'll be able to come up and ask questions of Irshad, okay?
And of you, Leah.
Right.
Because contrary to what the otherwise always correct Dean White has said, this is not actually going to be an interview. It's going to be a conversation. So I may have questions for Leah based on what she asks of me as well. So get ready to kind of, stump us with your questions too.
There you go. All right, so let me get started. So your book focuses on, and you can tell us more about the book in just a second, because I would guess that not everyone in this room has read the book, right? And I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, so we don't have to embarrass each other, right? About labeling, engaging, and listening to one another, and having conversations with each other or with individuals about race, identity, all those things. But it's about listening to each other so that we can encourage individuals about how to maneuver around the issues of diversity without inflaming what we know as the culture wars, right? So first, I want you to share a little bit with us about the book, and then also why you wrote this as a conversation with your dog, Lily.
Well, let me start with why I wrote Don't Label Me as a conversation with my Lily Bean, who, by the way, is now my late Lily Bean. She passed away actually in the middle of writing this book, but I managed to incorporate her voice even after that. Lily, I would have never thought of myself as somebody who is a mama to a dog. I grew up Muslim. I remain a faithful Muslim. And many, not all, but many Muslims are raised with the cultural idea, not a religious one, but the cultural idea that dogs are what is known as najis. That means dirty in Arabic. And not just physically dirty, but spiritually polluting. So that if you touch one, you're flirting with hellfire. And for all of my independence of thought, we buy into some of the conditioning with which we are raised, and I bought into that. I had a health crisis in my late 30s, and at that point, a friend of mine said to me, Irshad, you really have to evolve out of this fear of dogs. If you had a dog, you would understand the healing power that they have. So, for all of the medications and the medical interventions, I decided, let me see what this is about. And so I adopted the dog whom I thought would be the most docile, most, submissive, because I'm afraid of dogs at this point. And why did I think Lily would be that way? Because of her labels. She was old and she was blind. Well, it turns out labels can be pretty deceiving. She was the most feisty, sassy, brassy, non-human creature I've ever had the pleasure of interacting with. I remember one day I smeared peanut butter all over my lips just to try to lure a kiss from her. And she approached, remember, she's blind. She approached, she sniffed out the ploy, and she turned around and walked right away, preserving her dignity in the teeth of my pathetic manipulative scheme. And that's just one of any number of stories I can tell for how Lily did not live up to the baggage that went with the labels that I gave her. And if that's true of non-human animals, it is also true of us human animals, that whatever labels we give to one another, they do not remotely capture all that we are. And so I decided to write the book as a conversation with Lily, not only because she taught me that we are all, every single one of us in this room, we are all plurals. We are all so much more than meets the eye, as she was as well, but also because I learned, Leah, that when we risk having deep, meaningful relationships with those whom we fear as our other, it is amazing what we can learn, not just about them, but also about ourselves. And so Lily and I clash throughout the book. Oh, she disagrees with me on plenty, and I with her. And it turns out that what we learn from each other along the way is absolutely worth not just the conversation, but sometimes when we flirt with confrontation, that too teaches us about actually how to engage in ways that ensure respect.
Okay, so let's talk about the labels piece.
Yeah.
And in some ways, you're saying we shouldn't be labeled, right? Don't label me.
I want to nuance that in a second because
Okay.
titles never are nuanced, but go ahead.
Right. However, in many ways, until we identify who we are,
Yeah.
which means we label ourselves and we learn from ourselves, we can't move forward. And sometimes that label is who we need to share with the outside world.
Right. And I accept that. First of all, labels are not going away. We are all born with a brain that has a primal region, and that primal region is scanning for threats 5 times a second. That's a lot of threat detection. And we need to make sense of our surroundings. So of course we're going to label. We're going to label things and we're going to label people, right? What I'm though saying, Leah, is that we need to be, I think, using labels as starting points rather than as finish lines. So for example, if I have a certain politics and somebody else has very different, even what I perceive to be threatening politics, yes, I'm going to label them. But mostly, I'm going to then infuse meaning into that label with all of the baggage that that label stands for. And they may not actually live up to that baggage. They may be a lot more nuanced and interesting and contradictory and open than the label gives them credit for. So yeah, I'm not going to stop the fact that my primal brain will label, but unlike things, people are fluid. We are constantly moving in some way. Sometimes we're evolving, sometimes we're regressing, often we morph in ways that conventional wisdom can't begin to articulate. So rather than assume about people, if we really care, and that's if, I realize you're not, you don't have to care about everybody you come into contact with. But if we do care about any single human being, we need to show that respect by engaging rather than assuming.
Okay. And those assumptions, and as you say, we make those calculations in our brain very quickly.
Very quickly, split second.
And often those assumptions are correct assumptions.
Sometimes they are.
If you see someone with an assault rifle, right, and waving a flag, you are going to make an assumption about who they are.
Right.
Do we still engage in that conversation or do we protect ourselves?
How would you answer that?
I would not engage.
Right. So, and by the way, neither would I, okay? So by no means am I suggesting that, number one, we need to engage with everybody. 24 hours in a day, people. And some of us need our beauty sleep more than others, okay? So you can't do this with everyone. You've also, of course, got to use common sense. I say, and don't label me, that if somebody is brandishing an AK-47, right? And I'm not going to assume that they are there to dialogue with me. There's a reason they have that weapon. Now, if I'm cheeky, I may try to initiate a conversation and get ready to bolt. But I don't think that there's any point in having conversations with people who are not there in good faith. Here's the point, though. If you are not carrying, that I can see anyway, an arm, a weapon, why should I assume that you are not here in good faith? Mm-hmm. We leave so much social change on the table when we assume just by dint of, again, I'll go back to it, your political label. If we assume based on that, I have nothing to say to you, and I have nothing to learn from you, and you're going to be closed-minded, and you stand for evil, so screw you, we have nothing to say to each other.
Okay, so with that thought, in your book, you are very clear about your feelings about Trump. Where does that engagement begin? Because
So,
you've made,
yeah.
and I don't know if you've met him or not, or had conversations with him or not, but we've all seen him on TV, on shows, in person, whatever it's been.
Yep.
And we know but don't know.
So, I'm not a fan,
Okay.
okay, by any stretch. But what I've also had to explain to Trump supporters is that you are not Trump. And I don't assume that you are. You are you. You have your reasons for voting for him or for supporting him. And I'm actually interested in what those reasons are. Because I can't begin to understand, just based on my own life experience, what would attract you to someone who is, and I'll fill in the blank, a serial liar, a misogynist, a bigot on many, many levels. That's my perspective. That's not your perspective. So what is it that I'm missing about where you're coming from? And I will say, you'd think that in making it clear that any supporter of Trump is not Trump, and I'm accepting that and I'm acknowledging that, you would think that that would make some Trump supporters say, thank you, for acknowledging that I'm not one and the same. But they're not relieved by that. Many Trump supporters, and again, I speak from hard experience, assume that because I don't like him,
You won't like that.
I won't like them, and therefore I am, and then fill in the blank, right? All of these assumptions made about me. And so one of the things I say to Trump supporters is, you are a diverse lot too, right? Like, embrace the diversity of who you are within the tribe of MAGA. It's okay that I don't like Trump and that you don't like Biden or anybody else whom I might support. But let's actually talk about you and me now, not about these totemic figures who are not us. And when I make that point, that this is actually about you and me, not about them, the emotional defenses begin to come down. So we have, as a society, a lot of growing up to do. That when we say to the other, whoever the other is, you've got to grow up, we do too. Any one of us. Because it's often us, in the way we communicate what we believe, in a way that is shaming, in a way that is blaming, in a way that's demeaning and humiliating to the other. If we don't grow out of that bad habit, we're not giving the other any incentive to grow out of their bad habit. Is there anything at this point, Leah, that you want to take issue with? It's really, because you and I don't see eye to eye.
No,
on,
and so the labeling, right?
Yeah.
So I really believe that, and I don't necessarily call it labeling, but more claiming your identity, right? And I think it's important that each and every person get to a point where they understand who they are and that they are comfortable with their own identity before you can be comfortable with others, right? And then that will lead to conversation. But if you are denying who you are, what you believe in, how you see the world, then you can't see what other folks are going, or hear what other folks are going to say to you.
Funnily enough, we are absolutely on the same page about that. But I go a step further. I say that, for example, if you see yourself as a Black woman, okay, that's cool. But that doesn't mean that you are like every other Black woman. And by the way, every other Black woman is not like every other Black woman, right? So none of this is about denying who you are. It's about ensuring that when you do embrace certain labels for yourselves, you don't fix yourself and freeze yourself in what that label is supposed to represent. So, for example, we know from other speakers you've had in this series that there is such a thing as a black conservative. Sure, why wouldn't there be? Not all black people are the same. Not all black folks think the same. And to expect black folks to think the same. Otherwise, they're not black. Like, who are you? Who is any of us to say what qualifies as authentically black or not?
Sure.
And it's the same, by the way, I happen to be Muslim. If you know my backstory, you know that I don't think like every other Muslim out there. And you know what I've learned? Every other Muslim doesn't think like every other Muslim out there, right? So the point is, there is diversity within groups.
Sure.
And not just between groups. And my worry about how much of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is taught and practiced these days is that there is an expectation that individuals can be clumped into categories, and then there is monolithic thinking within those categories. And that's what representation means. No, it doesn't.
So it doesn't, but, so here's the thinking. The work of DEI now, and you sort of said we clump folks into groups, but it's also how, it's nice to think there's diversity within groups, and there is, and that everybody's going to see that and then move in a direction where we see each other as individuals. And we don't know, we know that doesn't always happen. There's groupthink.
Oh, yeah.
Right? There's conformity. There's bias conformity. There's all of that. And it's about how often we need to prepare ourselves for how people see us.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When I walk into a room, I don't know everyone in the room, but I know that they know when I walk in the room, they see a black woman. Mm-hmm. Right? And they may have assumptions. We all have bias. We all make assumptions about others. It would be lovely to think that they all are just waiting to get to know me as Leah, the individual. Mm-hmm. But often, depending on where we are, what the circumstances are, that's not how they will see me. And so you wrote the book in 2019. Mm-hmm. There have been major shifts that took place in our country, in our state, in our world in 2020, and since then, now we're in 2023. And in 2020, right, there was a whole George Floyd movement, and everybody said, oh, we gotta do more around diversity. We haven't done enough. So states, nations, governments were pouring money into, corporations, we need to do more around diversity. And then the shift changed very quickly now. And so looking at where we are from 2019 to now, I would have said 2 years ago, yes, we all need to really work on seeing each other as individuals and not labeling and not moving with that group think. But sometimes I think it is a way that folks have to protect themselves right now. So I want to suggest something that person of color to person of color, okay? I'm wanting everybody to eavesdrop on this conversation that you and I are having in that regard. Wouldn't it be fair to say that not just people of color, but anybody whose communities have a history of being marginalized walk into these proverbial meetings with a chip on our shoulder, assuming that everybody else is assuming something about me. And so I need to protect myself from them and their assumptions, when it could be just as true that many of the people in the room are seeing you as an individual, and yet because of our prejudices Was it
about
prejudice
them,
or lived experience?
I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive.
Okay.
Your lived experience, my lived experience, happens at the hands of people, of other people, right? Mm-hmm. Those people in the room are not always those people at whose hands we've had our lived experience. Sure. And I think that if we're going to, at some point, expect to be treated as all that we are, not just some of what we are, mm-hmm. not just the black woman, but the black woman who's, and then fill in the blank, right? Black woman who's so much more than the baggage of those labels, we too have to then be treating those people who we worry are assuming about us, we've got to treat them as individuals as well.
So I guess let me just take some of the terms back. I don't worry about it.
Okay?
Because I'm secure in who I am. I look around the room and say, okay, I'm recognizing who they may be, they're recognizing who I am, and I'm going to move forward with being my authentic self and engaging in those dialogues to open up. If there are bias, we're going to address those or have conversations or whatever it is. So I don't see it as a negative way of moving in the world, but more for me as a way of being positive and transparent and authentic and helping to engage in those conversations that may be different. And so it goes to what you talked about as honest diversity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
As distinct from dishonest diversity.
Right.
Right. So, from my perspective, dishonest diversity reduces people to their labels. And again, buys into the assumptions that go with whatever the label is. For example, black woman, angry. Queer Muslim, a freak. White straight guy, obviously the oppressor. There are assumptions made by reducing people to their demographic labels that simply may not be true about those people. That's dishonest diversity. Honest diversity incorporates diversity from the neck up. So, Leah, just because you're a black woman doesn't mean that I know everything I should know about you. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? How do you feel about this issue? Have you had personal experiences? Do you like tennis? What does that have to do with being a black woman? Well, not really anything, not even if you're, Coco Gauff, right? Maybe you're a great tennis player, maybe you're not. But the point is that you, again, are plural. There's so much more to you than meets the eye. And that is how to practice honest diversity, to recognize that no label or set of labels captures who we are as constantly evolving sentient creatures. Notice how Lily bucked the labels that were factual about her. Blind and old. That wasn't untrue. It was the assumptions that I made on the basis of those labels that were untrue.
So tell me how you see applying that theory with students who are just coming here from all over the world, right?
Yep.
With obvious assumptions about other cultures, other identities, other sexualities. We're not all from the same place, as you've noted.
That's right.
But how do we go about doing that?
So, it's very easy to assume that when we talk about having constructive conversations about contentious issues, that all you need to do is be nice. First of all, can I say none of this is about being nice? And look, I grew up in Canada. We like nice, okay? But that's not what this is about. In order to have conversations from which any of us can learn, conversations from which we can grow, we need skills. Skills. A professor asked me earlier today, I can tell my students all I want, be open to other people. But what does that even mean? How do you just be open to other people? Well, let me tell you a couple of ways to be open. When you engage, instead of telling people right away what your position is on the issue at hand, start with a question, and a sincere question, not a judgy question. When you start with a sincere question, like, how do you feel about the issue? You are saying to that person, I actually care where you're coming from. And there's this beautiful cliche, and it's a cliche because it's true, that Nobody cares how much you know about anything until they know how much you care about them. So when you can start any conversation about a contentious issue with a sincere question, how does this make you feel? Or have you had a personal experience when it comes to this issue? They will understand right away that their voice matters to you. And that's one way of bringing emotional defenses down. Another skill is to listen to what they have to say, but here's the key. Listen to learn, not to win. How many times, and I include myself in this, how many times in the back of our heads, when we're having discussion about politics or religion or, identity, there's this little voice, it's the voice of ego, okay? It's the primal brain that's saying, well, what about this? And what about that? When you catch yourself doing that, what you're really catching yourself doing is poking a hole in the other's argument. But guess what? You ask them a question. They're not giving you an argument. They're giving you an answer. And yet we so often get defensive about that answer because it doesn't cohere with what we want to hear. So then we decide that's an argument. And I'm not going to let you win. Excuse me. Not every discussion has to be a debate. So, if we can listen to learn, what I would be then saying, if I'm learning from you, is, Leah, thank you. Thank you for making that point, because I would have never come up with that on my own. And I would have never come up with that on my own, not because I'm stupid, but because I'm not you, and you're not me. So, yeah, you've given me something to think about. And incidentally, none of this means that we also have to agree, right? At the end of this conversation, Leah, I know that I'll be thinking about much of what you have said, because you've treated me with respect. And by that I mean respect comes from the Latin word respectate. Spectate means to look. Re means again. You have looked at me again. You haven't decided that your first impression of me is the only impression that you're going to have of me, because you've engaged me. So when I feel respected, I'm going to leave the conversation thinking, maybe she's got a point about this or that, right? That is what it is to listen to learn. And I'm going to let you know in the course of the conversation that you've given me something to think about. And that is another way of building trust, so that we can remain open with each other.
So how do we build that in the political climate that we're seeing now in our states? So we have issues around book banning, or getting rid of DEI training, or here on this campus, or not on this campus, on this state, compelled speech, and all of these things. So you're eroding the respect that has been built over hundreds of years. And folks are walking into states and classrooms and places where they feel disrespected already. And so engaging in conversations when we're also stripping individuals of knowledge, right? How do you continue to engage in conversations that lead to real dialogue and listening? And how do we get all of us to not debate, right? Because what we see, all of us have watched TMZ, X, right? Instagram, and folks are going at it. We've watched political debates, and they're about to start up again. There was just a debate a couple weeks back, and it's not a respectful discussion or listening. It is ugly.
It is ugly. And so first things first, please do not turn to influencers, opinion shapers, or yes, politicians as our role models for conversation, okay? They do not have a vested interest in any kind of reconciliation. Influencers are all about the clickbait. They're all about amping up your primal brain, not calming it down. Politicians, and I'm going to say something very uncomfortable about democracy. Politicians in a democracy are in it to win it. They are in a win-lose paradigm. Why would they have any interest in being role models of healthy conversation? If they're all about win-lose, you know that they're going to want to slam dunk the other. So why turn to them for any kind of inspiration? No, Leah, we've got to look to each other for that,
Sure.
right? And it's only, I know this is going to sound quaint, I get it, but I truly don't know any other way of sustaining a democracy that is worth its name. It's got to come from the bottom up.
But if we're not teaching those skills, if we're not demonstrating those
Yes.
skills,
Yes.
then who's going to get it, right?
And
We
this
will
is
continue.
this is why so much of the work that my team and I do is with educators, whether it's on college and university campuses or whether it's in K-12 schools. It is us who have to be role modeling these skills. And so when you say, for example, let's give a very concrete situation here. You talk about the book bans, right? You may be surprised to know, or not, that a lot of librarians go through the program that we offer at Moral Courage to become mentors of these skills. Why? Because they are the first people who have to know how to handle a library patron or a customer, as they're sometimes now known, who's coming into the library demanding that certain books be taken off the shelves. Librarians now have to know, how do I lower this person's emotional defenses so that I can motivate them to hear where I'm coming from as somebody who prizes information and knowledge? And what happens is, so much of the time, an angry library patron will realize, oh, you're actually not trying to impose this or that perspective on other patrons. When they come through that door angrily, they're all about the emotion. And when we can calm down their primal brains and actually have a discussion rather than a debate through the skills, some of which we've just talked about right now, often, not always, I get, but often they'll be like, okay, well, I still don't agree, but all right, I understand that in order to have books that reflect my point of view, you also need to have books that reflect somebody else's point of view.
So
I
you
don't
missed
like
a couple of governors then.
Well, like I say, you can't turn to the politicians to role model anything. And I understand that they create policies and they pass laws. But I'll give you another example of how perhaps we need to be ninjas of neuroscience more and more. Because we do a lot of work with educators, we hear all the time from both professors and from teachers in high schools, for example, who tell us that they've found ways to maneuver around the bans that have been imposed upon them. So, for example, there's this one science teacher who puts up the light spectrum, the visible light spectrum, in her classroom as a way of telegraphing, in Florida, by the way, as a way of telegraphing to LGBTQ students, you are safe here. And we can have conversations about your identity that the politicians tell us we can't. Just know that when that light spectrum is in the classroom, and it's science after all, you're welcome here, right? So I realize that we shouldn't have to go through these hurdles, this obstacle course, just to be decent to one another. Boy, do I ever get it. And I will tell you, and I said this actually to Dean White just before we started this evening, every single day, Leah, every single day without fail, I struggle with my faith in humanity. I will tell you, I wouldn't cry in my cornflakes if we went extinct.
Okay.
I kid you not. I wouldn't. Because everything that we've had to learn about decency has already been taught. We just haven't learned it. So all to say that I'm not disputing the injustices. What I'm asking everyone in this auditorium tonight is, in thinking about how to address those injustices, there's a singular question we all need to ask ourselves, and it's a deeply uncomfortable one. And the question is, am I in this to move the needle, or am I in this to feel superior? I'm not asking you to stand on a mountaintop and proclaim your answer to the rest of the world. But I am asking you to be honest enough to pose that question to yourselves. And if you're honest in your answer, you'll then know why you're motivated to treat your other in the way that you treat them.
Okay. And those are two, the opposing questions that you'd ask yourself.
Right, the choice that we need
I
to
think
make.
there's probably a spectrum in there, right? And you've got to get from one to the other. And
Sure.
How do you get there?
But keep it simple for now, right? Really, you have a choice. I have a choice every day. Even in my frustration with human beings, I have a choice. When I am in a conversation that is going sideways, am I wanting to slam dunk the person on the other end of that conversation because I am so opposed to what they're saying to me? If I slam dunk them, that's gonna feel really good for about 2 seconds. And then guess what? I've just bought myself backlash. And now I'm gonna be responsible for dealing with the backlash, which I have in part instigated. But if I realize that I actually wanna move the needle, and it's not gonna be instant, but it is gonna require that I create trust. I have to recognize my power to do that. And we all do have that power. Each one of us in any interaction has the power to shape what I call the culture of the conversation, right? So if I create trust, all right, I may not get from that person what I'm ultimately hoping for, but here's the deal. Chances are they'll be willing to talk to me again and again. And now we've got the foundation for a relationship. There are a few people here from a program right here at UNC called Relational Leadership at Carolina. These people teach this kind of leadership. And that's the kind of leadership that arrives at solutions in non-violent ways. If you want a solution tomorrow, you're probably going to be inflicting trauma along the way. If you want a solution that doesn't replicate the cycle of trauma, you've got to be nonviolent in how you communicate. And I'll just say one last thing about this, because I think it is so bloody brilliant. Many of the most successful, most effective activists in the US civil rights movement took training, relational
Nonviolence.
leadership training, before they went out on the front lines, because they knew they would be used as human ashtrays. People would, stamp out their cigarettes on them, they would spit at them, they would kick them, sick dogs on them. They knew what they were in for. And so they took several days of training to do what? Here was their phrase: to educate our emotions. Educate our emotions. Ultimately, that is how so much of the US civil rights movement achieved the gains that, yes, they did achieve, and how they ultimately wound up claiming moral authority.
And so with that thought, you know, the civil rights movement was almost 60 or more years ago now. We're back in the same cycle, right? Having to claim our rights, our civil rights, with folks hoping for a civil response for those who are traumatized, marginalized, killed even. And there's a point where you have to say, when do I stop being civil, right?
No, not right. In this sense. First of all, it's not either or. One of my former students is a hip hop artist and very active advocate of social justice. She does all the things that you would expect an ardent social justice activist to do, marches and protests and so forth. But she also sits down with the other to understand, what is it about how I'm communicating my message that may not be getting through? Now you could say, wow, that's a lot of work, and it's unfair to put that kind of expectation on people who are fighting for their rights. You may be right that it's unfair. But here's the deal, folks. We're all, in some way, dealt a lousy hand. Not a single one of us moves through this life free of some kind of adversity. And so, if you can reframe what some would call emotional labor, if you can reframe that as, I'm going to learn how to do this effectively, because that will give me the advantage, not just in this situation, but in every other situation that could become us against them. Even in my own family. Use it as a way of developing a skill set that will allow you to outwit, outsmart the conflict entrepreneurs, the people who are constantly looking for an opportunity to turn potential progress into us against them. With healthy communication skills, you can actually outwit these people.
Possibly, if people listen, right? So you're counting on people to listen.
Can I nuance what you've just said?
Sure.
People will listen even if it's not those people who are listening. There are other people who are always paying attention, who are watching, who are overhearing. And I can't begin to tell you how often the folks whom we train to become, mentors of moral courage, mentors of these skills, say to us, I didn't realize that my students were watching when I handled this situation in a nonviolent way. I didn't realize how closely my kids are paying attention when I do this. I didn't realize how often my friends are looking at me thinking, if she can do that, why can't I? So yeah, it's true you can't win them all. Absolutely. But you'd be surprised how many people you can equip, not just inspire, equip to become better as human beings and as players in this game of power and in the game of sharing power equally. You'd be surprised. The key here is to try.
I absolutely believe in trying.
Right.
And my thought is about getting everyone to try.
Yeah.
Right.
Leah, I only wish, honestly, that I had the skills that I'm now talking about. I only wish I had those skills 30 years ago when I was an activist for reform in my faith of Islam. I made one mistake over and over and over again, and that was to turn potentially healthy discussions into debates. And I did that out of my own insecurity. I did that out of my own fear. My fear of being told, Irshad Manji, you're not a real Muslim. You are a corrupter of our youth. You are inauthentic. That fear, my trauma, led me to then re-traumatize others by turning discussions into debates. And the worst part of it all is that I actually did violence to my own health that way. Since adopting and turning into habits the kinds of skills that I'm talking about this afternoon, I can honestly tell you that I'm a healthier and happier person because now I've relieved myself of the burden to be right all the time. It's amazing how much of a shredder we put our nervous systems through when we assume that any interaction in which someone disagrees with us, that our role in that interaction is to put them in their place. Otherwise, we're complicit in their evil. Folks, we don't realize in that moment how much stress we are dealing to ourselves when we do that. So if we can learn to stand our ground, right? I'm not asking anyone to compromise what they believe. Stand your ground and at the same time create common ground. Standing your ground is about what you believe. Creating common ground is about how you express what you believe. If you can leave your other feeling respected, that'll take a huge weight off of your shoulders. And I know no one wants to hear this next part, but you might actually learn something that'll make you a better communicator of your own point of view down the road. It really is a win-win.
I'm going to hope so. Well, I think we are ready to open up for questions.
Sure.
Because I want to make sure everybody has a chance to
Absolutely.
engage in the conversation.
Yeah.
So if you have a question, just come on down. There'll be a mic for you. Don't be shy.
And can I just say, I'm not the kind of person who needs a question. You can even make a statement. I'm cool with that. If you want to dissent, push back, critique, I'm here to learn too.
There you go. Come on down. Help yourself.
Okay, how would you say the conversation with your parents being Muslim has changed as you've gained skills
Well, so the question is, how have conversations with your own parents gone since you've, especially as a Muslim, since you've developed these skills? Funny you should ask. Seriously, because I write in Don't Label Me that my relationship with my mother hasn't always been the healthiest. For all kinds of reasons, we have been for many, many years at loggerheads. And honestly, it was only when I started taking my own advice for her. You know, I used to tell my mother, Mom, remember, the Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said that the greatest jihad is not the one against our enemy, our physical enemy. It's the one against our own ego, Mom. So, you got to manage your anger, Mom, right? I would tell her that, and, she would be even angrier because I'm bringing something from the religion back to her. You know what my big mistake was? I would lecture to her, but I would never take that advice myself. And it was only when I stopped trying to fix her and started fixing me that within a very short period of time, everything that I wanted her to do, she started doing. Because now she didn't feel judged. And she realized that now I have credibility. I have integrity because I'm practicing what I'm preaching. So these skills have actually, not magically, scientifically improved my relationship with my mom in ways that I can't even calculate. We have the best relationship now. We'll still tease one another. We'll still heartily disagree with one another on all kinds of issues. But we'll also laugh a lot about our disagreements. And from time to time, we learn from one another. It's all about letting go of the judgment and letting us be who we are. Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Are you asking for personal reasons?
No, I'm just wondering.
Just wondering. Okay. You have a good relationship with your parents?
Yeah.
And you guys disagree on a lot?
Yeah.
Yeah? Wonderful. I think maybe then you need to, become a mentor of moral courage skills, because there's a whole lot of people your age who would love to be in the position that you are. So thank you for giving us hope.
Other questions? There you go.
How can we counteract,
It's the microphone, go ahead.
It's not the voice of God, I assure you.
you spoke about how using logic and healthy communication can help counteract emotions the way that they can kind of affect our ability to see the sides of others. But how can we counteract trauma that affects reason when people everywhere are actively being traumatized? How can we use our growth that it sounds like a lot of people here are fortunate enough to be in a position to explore that and understand it a little more, while there are a lot of other people who are in positions where they can't really grow and foster that change themselves.
So, that again, it's not, there's no bullet point answer to a question like that. Let me be very clear about one thing. By no means am I saying we need to counteract emotions. First of all, emotions are human. Love is an emotion. Empathy is an emotion. Grace is an emotion. These are pro-social emotions. They're wonderful emotions to have. So I'm not for a minute suggesting that we should eradicate emotion from, who we are. I'm saying that there are ways to channel those emotions so that they can coexist with thinking. We are feeling creatures who are capable of thinking. And when we allow those two things to happen at the same time, that is the sweet spot. Now, you ask about trauma. I get that there are lots of people all over the world, some of whom might even be here in this room, who feel that they are not ready or capable or equipped to deal with the trauma that they have been through and now carry right into their day-to-day lives. One of the things that I know I have to get better at is acknowledging from the get-go that if you have trauma, I may inadvertently step on it. I may, in anything I say, in anything I do. But precisely because it's your trauma, I have my own, by the way, and you may inadvertently step on mine. I can't hold you responsible for stepping on my invisible trauma. I have to be proactive enough to say, hey, listen, I went through that, okay? Let me tell you how it really feels, right? So I can't hold you responsible for not knowing, but I can hold you accountable for being open to hearing about it. And it's the same with you, right? You can't be responsible for stepping on something that you didn't know about me. But I hope you're open to hearing about why I feel so differently about a situation that to you may be blindingly obvious. That is the contract that we need to have in this interaction. That's what I mean about creating a culture of the conversation. And let me just give you one other skill, if I may, about how to establish the culture of the conversation. I mentioned earlier, we are all so much more than the assumptions of the labels that we have, right? There's so much about you I can't know just by looking at you. So I can start any conversation with you saying, hey, listen, I know that we're probably going to disagree on this issue, but I also know that you're so much more than meets my eye. So I can't judge anything about you based on this one interaction, because you're more than that. Can you remember the same about me? That I'm more than this issue or this disagreement? And if you can establish that that's the contract we're going to have in this interaction, then what you've just done is two things. You've created common ground, because it's a common rule of engagement that we're going to have. And that common ground is going to breed trust. That's the point of having common ground, is that you're creating trust. And without trust, no difference between us can be explored constructively, right? At the same time as you're creating that trust, you are also letting the other person know, I'm not going to judge you. And that's going to be a relief. Because as social science tells us over and over again, there is one thing more than death that we human beings fear, and that is judgment. No wonder religions that combine death with a day of judgment are so damn powerful.
I think we have a question here, and I'm going to ask maybe people with questions can form a line here. I think that'll make this more efficient.
Hi, Kevin Marinelli, Department of Communication and Program for Public Discourse. Thank you both for a wonderful conversation. I have a question / pushback, and it's for both of you. So first, Professor Manji, I can tell that you're clearly invested in social science and brain science in particular, and you keep coming back to the primal brain. And you mentioned earlier that our initial instinct is to label an identity, but then we want to arrive at the individual. But I'm curious if we can complicate that by thinking about how, one, emotions are already mediated, and two, identities are also already mediated. We may experience it as an instinct, as a primal instinct, but there's a whole lot of culture and discourse that produces those emotions and those identities. And so thinking about it that way, I'm curious how that might complicate this tension you addressed earlier between do we refer to the individual or do we refer to the label in group? Thank you.
Yeah. No, Kevin, it definitely complicates everything. We do not exist as an island, any one of us. We are suffused by influences, cultural influences, social influences that are part and parcel of the education that we get, whether that education is formal or not. And so I'll give you a quick example of something that burns me up, okay? but I'm being honest with you. It kills me, Kevin, that today so many people who take offense at anything I say or you say, when they're given the opportunity to actually, in this case, sit down with me and tell me more about why they're so offended, they will often say, no, I can't meet with her. I don't feel safe. Where did that come from? It isn't something that I recall saying when I was a university student. When somebody who you profoundly disagreed with invited you to tell them more and possibly teach them something that they didn't already know? At the very least, you would say, I don't have the time, I'd love to down the road, and thanks for the invitation. At the best, you would take them up on the invitation because this is an opportunity to possibly change that person's mind. Nobody ever said, I don't feel safe. So you're absolutely right that how people perceive situations and power and privilege today is mediated. It's not something that is always just authentic to who we are. We are often told what to believe about different people, different groups of people, and about contexts in which we find ourselves. And this is why I'm such a big believer in curiosity, in living, this will be cheesy, but bear with me, a wonderful life. A life that is full of wonder. And actually complicating the complicators. In those who want to say something is problematic because maybe right, but then in allowing yourself to problematize their problematizing and go back and forth to really hash out what you think, not what you're supposed to think, but what coheres with your values, your own lived experiences, your own intuitions, and then go forward from there. Always keeping in mind that you and I, none of us has the full truth of anything, which is exactly why we need to be open to different arguments, because those arguments will often teach us something we could have never come up with on our own. Hence the centrality of free speech. It's, again, not about anything goes. It's about, I want to grow. And we can't do that if only certain perspectives are allowed.
So, Kevin, let me just go back just a little bit in your story. And I think, and you said that folks will come in and say, I don't feel safe. And oftentimes folks just don't show up because they don't feel safe. So they're not going to voice it, but because of what you've just asked about their lived experience, the labels and the perceived identities of others, if asked to come into a conversation, I don't know that every conversation I've gone into that I felt safe, and I just decided, you know what? It's not worth my internal trauma that I might feel or perceive that I might feel to even go and engage in that conversation at this time. And depending on my age and where I was, right? Because age plays a lot in what we do sometimes, because if we're 15, 16, 18, 17, depending on how you've grown up, that could be a lot for you, and it could be traumatic, and it could shape the rest of your life. And so sometimes you need to protect your own self by saying, you know what, I'm not going to do well in that environment. I'm not going to feel safe, and it could crush me. So today, I'm okay if I don't engage. It's okay.
Okay, and Leah, please know, I thoroughly respect that unpacking of what it means to feel safe or not safe. The problem is that these days, so many people, not just students, all kinds of people, let me assure you, we work with corporations as well, and I'm talking about managers, employees, even executives. So many people will rail about something that they are offended by. And when they're given the chance to contribute to a solution by saying more about it, no, I don't feel safe.
Right.
Okay? So this is the trade-off, right? If you actually want solutions, you gotta be willing to contribute to those solutions.
But you got to feel
by
a sense of
being
trust.
But that's my point.
Right.
Is that there are ways for people like you and me, educators, to create a sense of trust so that when somebody who's wanting me to understand something that I don't yet get can be assured that when I invite them to have a conversation with me, I'm there to listen, not to debate. And so
And they may not be afraid of the debate,
Yeah.
but the consequences from the debate,
Right.
which then leads
But
them to
again-
feeling unsafe.
Okay, then I'm just going to put a final finishing flourish on all of this, which is that, okay, if you're going to feel unsafe and there's nothing I can do to help you feel safe, then just accept that railing against the problem
Sure.
is what is your only outlet now, right? You can't be part of the solution if you're not willing to stretch yourself into what you consider possibly unsafe territory. And I don't know about all of you, but if all I can do is complain about something, again, might feel good for a couple of seconds, and then I feel utterly powerless to do anything more. I'm suggesting that we all have the capacity to exercise more agency, more power, so that we really can do something about the injustices that we would otherwise only be protesting.
Okay. Here's a thought.
So if I may, actually building off this question we were just having, sometimes there are, knowing whether an engagement is in bad faith or not, whether the other actor is acting in bad faith, is often much more complicated than whether they're holding a gun at you or not. What do you think are some ways to identify when an engagement is in bad faith, or if it's heading that direction and it's something that is not productive to engage in?
Yeah, great
Thank you.
question. So, remember just a few minutes ago, right? I suggested that one way of starting a potentially contentious conversation is to say, hey, you know, we may disagree about this, but I bet you are so much more than just this issue or this disagreement. And so there's no way, I have no legitimacy judging you on the basis of this interaction. Can you remember the same about me? If that person says, no, I don't think I can remember the same about you, you know that this is probably not going to be very healthy. And at that point, I wouldn't hold it against you if you said, okay, well, in that case, I'm just going to have to leave because it's not going to go anywhere. That is constructive, right? If you exercised any one of these tips that we talked about this afternoon, and at a certain point you realize, hey, you know, now it's my turn to actually state where I'm coming from. Let's say you said to your other, so listen, thanks so much for, you know, giving me context I didn't have before. That's really helpful. Now, do you mind if I share a little bit about where I'm coming from? And if they say, nah, I'm not interested, I'm good. All right, now you know that they weren't in this in good faith, right? But even then, I would suggest this. Instead of losing it because they were rude to you or they didn't reciprocate your good faith with their own, thank them for their time and let them know that when they're ready to give you the fair hearing that you've given them, we can pick it up where we've left off. In other words, leave the ball of accountability in their court. Because if you say, F you, you're an ass, I'm out of here, okay, again, that'll feel good, but guess what? You've just wasted, 10 minutes of your time getting to that point. And if you say, on the other hand, all right, then I guess we'll agree to disagree, think about what you're saying right there. Agree to disagree. What that means is you two have nothing left to say to one another. That may be true, but how do you know? Give them a reason to think about the respect with which you treated them. And you may be surprised how often they'll come back to you to say, I really appreciated, you know, how you left that conversation. I'm ready to talk. I'm not saying it'll happen all the time, but I am saying that on issues that you profoundly care about, not Not just stuff that you could go either way, you know, how do you like your hamburger dressed? No. On issues that you profoundly care about. This is an investment of emotional discipline that may be very much worth your time.
I just wanted to ask, you talked a lot about building, like, make social justice to building trust and openness. And that works on a small scale, but how do you do that on a large scale where you need to convince a large number of people that, like, for example, LGBTQ people deserve to exist? How does that work?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm going to give you a very practical answer. We actually have a case study of how that works. If you go to moralcourage.com and go to the impact page, there is a case study called Public Policy. And in it is the story of how Equality Utah, which is that state's premier LGBTQ advocacy group, how they used the skills of moral courage. This is going to blow you away. Not only to get Republicans on side, on an issue that they were completely on the opposite side of, but they actually got both the House and the Senate in the state of Utah to vote unanimously for a pro-LGBTQ policy that otherwise would have gone down in complete defeat. And you know what the key was? It was to simply ask the Republicans to come without our lawyers there. Let's sit down and let's get to know each other. And one of the other things that, I'm saying this in order to fascinate you enough to read the case study, okay? One of the other things that the advocate, the LGBTQ advocate did, the Republican that was sponsoring this anti-LGBTQ bill, that Republican mentioned that he was reading a book. I think it was about prohibition. The LGBTQ advocate downloaded the Kindle version of that book, started to read it, got really intrigued by it, texted the Republican to say, hey, I can understand why you're totally fascinated by this book. I am too now. Thanks for the tip. And he was saying that not strategically, but actually because he felt comfortable saying that because they had developed a bit of a friendship. On that basis alone, the Republican invited him back for a deeper conversation, at which point that Republican decided, you know, there is common ground here, and we can work it out. Again, I don't want to suggest that hand-holding harmony breaks out. Anytime you engage in these ways. But here is what I am saying, and it goes back to something that Leah and I talked about at the very end of our formal conversation. You don't know how much social change you're leaving on the table if you don't try, right? If you just assume that because that guy's a Republican, there is nothing that we have to say to each other, you might be right. You might, but you will not. What do you have to lose by trying to develop a relationship with him or her?
Okay, so I was just gonna ask, at what point in your life did you really come into this awareness of how to behave during discussions with others? Was there some single point of inspiration, or was it kind of just a culmination of events?
What a wonderful question, thank you. And you know what? There was a single point, I can't say of inspiration, because the point was when I was wheeled into the emergency room of a hospital after having ingested so much toxic energy that I was contributing to in my activism as a religious reformer. I had fallen into a deep clinical depression. I was having panic attacks. And in this particular moment, most inopportune time, because that's when medical emergencies happen, at the most inopportune time, just before the biggest media interview of my life, I went into a seizure. And that summer, I realized something had to change about the way I am advocating for what I believe. And I assumed at first that what had to change was my beliefs, that the beliefs themselves that I have, the convictions I have, what I'm advocating for, no one's ever going to listen to, so forget it, it's just not worth it. And then my assistant, who was heavily into neuroscience, sent me a bunch of readings. And he said, Professor, please read these. And over time, I realized it's not my convictions that needed to change. It was how I was communicating them. In such a defensive, fearful, anxious way that if somebody didn't agree, I would get even angrier. When I stopped doing that, when I simply let people be and heard where they were coming from, and then developed the trust to then have them hear where I was coming from, you know what happened? This is no word of exaggeration. The very people who I thought I had no hope of influencing are the very people who then wound up asking me to teach them how to teach these ideas to their own congregations. I had been waiting a decade for that kind of a response. And the more I did this, the more I was assured I wouldn't get that response. So that single moment of seizure and then being registered in the emergency room snapped me out of my slumber. And it was science that put me on a path to health and much, much greater happiness all around. And thank you.
Hi. So I just want to start by saying thank you for answering our questions and speaking with us.
You bet.
So I am interested in doing work in civil rights and social justice. And so it stood out to me when you mentioned the civil rights movement and how successful activists of that time had to educate themselves on their emotions. And I also had noticed in the past that same strategy and how they intentionally put themselves in situations where they knew they would be attacked and they knew they would be harmed and disrespected, publicly humiliated, and all of that. And I also agree with what, I think your name is Miss Leah. I don't know for sure. I'm sorry if I messed that up. But I agree with you when you mentioned how about 60 plus or so years later, we're now in the position where we're going through the same cycle. But I think I've noticed that it's been different in the way that these people attack. So being someone who's interested in going into this work, and I am someone who I would believe is willing to try to move this needle, as you mentioned, and put myself in those unsafe positions if needed to get that needle moved along. So for someone in that position, how would you recommend they engage in those types of conversations where they are socially being attacked in that same way that those individuals in the civil rights movement were being attacked racially and with other discriminations as well?
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you for your courage in being willing to put yourself in unsafe situations as you see them unsafe. Obviously, that takes guts. And nothing valuable, nothing worthwhile is achieved without guts. So kudos for putting yourself out there. I also care about you, my friend, as a fellow human being. And so I want you to know, and this is my piece of advice in direct response to what you asked. You don't have to engage all the time. Activism, especially effective activism, is hard. And it is often depleting. And so when you're tired, accept that. Draw your boundaries. there is no need to get baited into or pulled into a conversation that you don't have the energy for. And I'll tell you briefly how I did that when I was, in my activist chapter of life. When I was advocating for reform in my faith of Islam, it was at a time when Islam was the most polarizing issue on God's green earth, like shortly after 9/11 and several years thereafter. And so there were no shortage of journalists always wanting me to comment on this, that, or the other. And of course, to give the message that I had, publicity and reach, I did a ton of interviews and worldwide interviews, not just here in the US. So naturally, whenever I entered an airport for my next flight, I'm there minding my own business, sometimes with a baseball cap on, often, during winter, so with a heavy overcoat, just sitting quietly, waiting at the gate. And invariably, somebody would recognize my face and would sidle over and say, hey, aren't you that Islam lady? Okay, here's my question, right? And they would want to talk. And I learned to say, sir, you know that I do a lot of talking. This is my hour off. Thank you for understanding. Not, do you understand? Not, I hope you can understand. No, I have faith in you. Thank you for understanding. And you know what? They always did. Because I drew my boundaries and I stuck to them. Unless you truly believe that you can be the best version of yourself in any given engagement in which you have a choice to say, yes, I'm ready, or no, I'm not ready. If you're not ready, it's okay. Say no. You don't have to rip someone's head off. You don't have to say, I'm not here to educate you. You don't even have to say, you educate yourself, because guess what? They might be reading people you don't want them to read as part of their education, right? You can do this in a way that is compassionate to them and compassionate to you. This is my hour off. When I'm ready, I'll come find you. Thanks so much. And then you move on. But you have to stick to your boundaries. Do you think you're capable of drawing those boundaries?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, I'm proud of you for that. Because I tell you, my friend, that's going to be a lifesaver. Thank you again for thinking about this in such a deep way. It's not just emotion that moves the world. It's that combination of being thoughtful and being driven by the emotions that make us passionate about what we believe in. So, rock on, sister.
So there were a couple things that I would also tell you, right, that, and I agree 100%, take care of you first, right? Those civil rights leaders didn't always take care of themselves, and many of them did not live long, right? Or the toll that it took on their bodies was very destructive in the end, and their lives were shortened. So one, educate yourself on the topics that you think are important regarding your civil rights. Whatever the issue is that you feel like you want to engage in, educate yourself. Like, don't just jump in there thinking that you know. And then, right, as Irshad talked about, don't go with the debates that we see on TV. That education also requires that you listen to others, right? Because you can't effectively craft an argument if you don't know what other people are saying, right? So you have to listen and then educate yourself, and then find the group, the organization, whatever it is that you are passionate about to be a part of, because you don't have to always do it by yourself, right? You're not alone in the struggle. You just have to figure out which bus to get on, okay?
Having said that, though, Leah, one of the things that I know many activists struggle with is how to have healthy disagreements within our own movement.
Mhm.
Yeah? Because you might get on the bus that is totally your bus. These are my people. This is my tribe. But if you ask a question that other people don't want you to be asking, that too could be very distressing in how you get treated.
Sure.
Right? So again, be true to who you want to be, not just who you are right now, but who you are wanting to become. And without for a moment having to condemn anyone else, just know that, and it goes right back to something Leah implied, if you don't take care of yourself, nobody else will. Nobody. You take care of you. And that's how you can be the most useful to everyone else you care about. Okay.
All right. We have hit the magic hour and beyond. So I want to thank you for this conversation. This was lovely. Thank you. And
Leah.
thank you all for coming. Thank you, my friend.
There should be pizza in the lobby.